The lead scientist, Kelto, was 3 drinks past reason. When asked what was wrong, he hiccuped, 112 years of work, and then the human said, hold my beer, and did it in a single day. He wasn't even a scientist. The neon lights of the event horizon bar flickered in a sickly shade of violet, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the desperate faces of 100 different worlds. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the pungent sting of fermented starfruit. It was a place for people who wanted to be forgotten, a place where names mattered less than the credits in your pocket. But tonight, the patrons weren't looking at the dancers or the view of the nebula outside the station's rim. They were staring at the booth in the far corner. There sat Kelto. To the galaxy, Kelto was a titan of intellect. As managing director of the Unified Anomaly Commission, he was a Cavalli of the High House entrusted with the Council's most prestigious scientific endeavors. Usually draped in crisp, white laboratory silks, his eye stalks held the quiet dignity of a man who spoke the language of the stars. Tonight, he was a wreck. His silks were stained with synthale. His primary crest was matted and drooping over his face like a wilted leaf. No one had ever witnessed him this drunk. It was like watching a library burn down in slow motion. Kelto? A voice whispered. A Garthan named Rack, an old friend from the university days, looked at the mountain of empty tubes on the table and winced. Kelto, by the great core, what are you doing? If the council sees you like this, they'll strip your clearance before morning. Kelto looked up, his 4 eyes struggling to focus on his friend. A bitter, jagged laugh escaped his throat. Clearance? Rack? They can have it. They can take the clearance, the titles, and the 10-ply laboratory tissues. I am finished. The UAC is finished. Talk to me, Rack urged. Is it the project? Is it the veil? Kelto's expression darkened instantly. He gripped his glass so hard the synth crystal groaned. The Shimmer-Veil. 112 years, Rack. My grandfather started the observation. My father spent his prime years on the sensors. And I spent 20 years as managing director. He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, as if he could see through the hull of the station to the anomaly itself. 4 light-years of beautiful, iridescent space anomaly, Kelto hissed. To the layman, it's a wonder of the cosmos, a curtain of aurora borealis draped across the stars. They write poems about it. They paint it. But to us, it was the ultimate mathematical insult, a nightmare of hyperadaptive spatial geometry. Kelto leaned over the table. Imagine a place, Rock, where the laws of cause and effect simply resign, where entropy forgets its purpose and geometry turns into a predator. We sat there in the high-orbit observation station, Ethelgard, thousands of us representing the finest minds of 12 species, the peak of galactic intellect, sipping our flavorless nutrient broths and pretending we were in control of the vacuum. We had supercomputers running at 10 to the power 24 floating point operations per second, Rock. We were crunching variables so dense they would make a ZID's neural crystals shatter from the sheer complexity of the data stream. We treated that anomaly like a god that could be bargained with through the language of mathematics. And, Rack asked, and nothing. Kelto slammed his hand on the table, causing the empty tubes to rattle. Every bridge we tried to build collapsed the moment it touched the veil. Every experimental craft we sent, ships worth more than entire planetary economies, failed. Our theory was that it was a perfect shield, left behind by an ancient civilization, a defense that required a perfect object to pass. He shook his head, his crest twitching in a rhythm of pure despair. The veil is reactive, Rack. It doesn't just sit there, it senses. If we sent a ship with a perfectly smooth hull, the veil would shift its phase until our hull became a series of jagged, exploding atoms. If we sent an energy beam, the veil became a perfect insulator. It changed according to the object. It was always one step ahead, always mirroring us, always destroying us. We thought we needed more math. We thought we needed more elegance. Kelto took a final, deep gulp of his drink and wiped his mouth with a trembling hand, his eyes wide with a haunting realization. We were the elite of the elite, Rock. We were the guardians of logic, the masters of the measurable universe. And yet, he let out a dry, rattling laugh. We were just dismantled by a human who looked at our 100 years of our failure, handed a chilled beverage to another human, and uttered a phrase that I now realize is the most terrifying sequence of words in the human tongue. "What words, Kelto?" Rack whispered. Kelto's voice dropped to a terrified hush. "Hold my beer." It's not just a request, Rack. It's a declaration of war against the laws of probability. When a human says those words, they aren't just stepping into danger. They are informing the universe that its rules no longer apply to them. Kelto's eyes glazed over as the memory took hold. He didn't see the grime of the bar anymore. He saw the sterile, cold light of the Ethelgard command deck. He leaned into the booth, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic thrum, speaking as if he were back on that bridge, watching the world end, or perhaps watching it begin. "I was standing on the observation gantry," Kelto said, "surrounded by the scientists from Council of 12. We were staring at a failed data stream. My lead ballistics officer, a stern Garthan with 3 centuries of tactical experience, had just informed me that our latest attempt, a kinetic slingshot probe moving at 0.9 C, had been converted into a cloud of harmless glitter the moment it touched the veil. Another 10 billion credits, gone. Another theory, incinerated. I was about to order a total system reset when the proximity chime rang. It was a pathetic sound, like a dying bird. "Director," my sensor tech said, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and pity. "We have a contact, coming in from the slow side of the sector." I looked at the main view screen. Emerging from the void was a small, battered vessel. It was a human hauler ship called the Rusty Bucket. Rack, I'm telling you, that name wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal description. The hull was a patchwork of mismatched alloys. It had oxidation streaks that looked like weeping sores. It was a technological tragedy. I hailed them immediately. My voice was tight with the exhaustion of 100 years of failure. "Human vessel, this is Managing Director Kelto of the UAC. Stop your engines. You are entering a death zone. Adjust your course by 180 degrees or prepare for molecular deconstruction. The field ahead does not permit passage." The screen flickered. The transmission was low bandwidth, grainy, and smelled, if a transmission can smell, of stale grease. Instead of a disciplined captain in a pressed uniform, I found myself staring at a human male. His beard was a chaotic bird's nest, seemingly held together by static and crumbs. His eyes were slightly unfocused, possessed by a sort of heavy-lidded nonchalance. He didn't look like a pioneer. He looked like a man who had spent the last decade sleeping in his clothes. As he looked at us, he was using a small, jagged metal tool to pick something out of his teeth. "Death zone, huh?" the human rasped. He didn't even stop picking at his molars. "That's a shame. My nav computer says this is a shortcut to the Orestes hub. If I go around, I lose 3 weeks of fuel. I got a cargo of perishable synthetic proteins, and my refrigeration unit is, well, it's making a sound like a cat in a blender." "You don't understand," I shouted, leaning into the camera. I wanted to shake him. "We have spent a century here. We have sent every experimental craft imaginable. We sent plasma array ships, dissolved. We sent gravity well manipulators, crushed. We sent the smoothest, most mathematically perfect hulls ever forged. The Veil simply adapted and shattered them. Our conclusion is absolute. The Veil is a perfect defense. It requires a perfect object to pass, a harmonic match we cannot find." The human stopped picking his teeth. He leaned forward, his face filling the screen. He reached off camera and produced a condensation-covered can of fermented liquid. That's what they call beer, Rack. He cracked it open with a sound that seemed to echo through my silent, sophisticated bridge. He took a long, agonizingly slow draw from the can, his throat bobbing. Then he let out a sigh that sounded like a venting steam pipe. "Adapts, does it?" he asked, squinting at the iridescent wall on his own monitors. "So let me get this straight, Mr. Director. If I go in there with a fancy ship, it builds a fancy trap, it looks at what I'm bringing, and makes a counter move." "Exactly," I replied, my eye stalks twitching with academic fervor. "It reacts to symmetry, to technology, to the very intent of the design. We have spent a century trying to outthink it, to be more perfect than the machine." The human looked away from the screen. toward his co-pilot. She was a younger female, feet propped up on a dashboard that was literally missing several buttons. She was digging into a crinkled plastic bag, pulling out some sort of orange, salt-covered snack. They looked like they were watching a boring documentary, not staring into the maw of a cosmic god. The captain looked back at me. A terrifying, slow grin spread across his face, a grin that defied every law of logic I had ever studied. "Kelto, buddy," the human said. I winced at the familiarity, but he didn't care. "You're overthinking it. You're trying to play chess with a tornado. You're bringing all this perfection to a door that's looking for a reason to stay closed." I stood there, my secondary hearts pounding against my ribs in sheer insulted disbelief. Kelto said, leaning so far over the bar table that his shadow swallowed the spilled synthale. I remember my voice actually cracking over the comms. I screamed at the screen, "Overthinking? You think we are stupid? You think 100 years of the galaxy's finest minds miss something as simple as whatever primitive nonsense you're suggesting? We are the UAC. We have decoded the genome of stars. We have..." Kelto let out a sharp, jagged breath. And he didn't even let me finish. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his intellect. He just looked past the camera like I was a buzzing insect that was slightly distracting him from a far more interesting thought. He stood up, his chair creaking under him. He handed his half-finished can to the younger human. "Hold my beer," he said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm gonna go get uncalculated." The screen went black. I stood there, surrounded by the most brilliant scientists in the galaxy, and for the first time in 112 years, the bridge was absolutely silent. We didn't know what uncalculated meant, but we were about to find out. Kelto's glass was empty, but he didn't seem to notice. He was staring into the middle distance, his four eyes unblinking, fixed on a memory that clearly still haunted his scientific soul. "I ordered the station's high-resolution deep space cameras to lock onto the rusty bucket," Kelto whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of lingering fury. "I didn't do it out of curiosity. I did it out of spite. I wanted to watch the consequences. The human had cut the transmission without permission, without protocol, without fear. That alone was insulting." On the display, I could see him inside his cockpit, gesturing animatedly. He was murmuring to his assistant and several other humans who had apparently been loitering in parts of the ship our scans had not previously identified as habitable. They nodded, they shrugged. One of them scratched his back with what looked suspiciously like a welding torch. I scoffed. "Observe," I said aloud, unable to keep the acid from my voice. "This is the species that believes it can outwit a hyper-adaptive spatial phenomenon older than their civilization." My lead ballistics officer let out a low, appreciative chuckle. "Director," he said, "I believe they are arguing." "Of course they are," I replied. "They always argue. It is how they approximate thought." That earned a ripple of laughter across the bridge. Even I joined in. It felt good, therapeutic almost, to mock something smaller than us for a change. For the first time in years, the Shimmer-Veil did not feel like it was laughing at us. But then, the laughter stopped. We watched in utter, speechless confusion as the airlock of the rusty bucket hissed open. 4 humans in bulky, antiquated vacuum suits drifted out. They weren't carrying scientific instruments. They were carrying magnetic tethers and welding torches. They moved toward the graveyard, our field of 1,000 failed dreams. And then, rock. They started scavenging. For hours, we sat in a silence so thick you could hear the station's life support fans. We watched these barbaric humans drag pieces of our history toward their ship. They took a jagged 3-ton hull plate from a shattered Ixian scout and strapped it to their starboard side using literal steel cables. They took a bent thermal radiator from a Garthan cruiser and welded it to their nose at a 45-degree angle. They found a discarded communications dish and foam sprayed it onto their engine block. By the time they were done, the ship possessed the aerodynamic profile of a frantic shrug. It looked less like a vessel and more like an insurance claim in search of an accident. It looked like a pile of space junk that had developed a malignant tumor. It defied every aesthetic and structural law in the known galaxy. I looked at my sensor readings, and my secondary heart nearly stopped. "Captain!" I shouted into the comms. Stop. Look at your telemetry. Your ship's center of mass is fluctuating wildly. It is shifting 3 meters every few seconds. What kind of advanced hauler ship is this? What stabilized compensation drive are you using to manage a shifting mass signature that complex? The human's face appeared on the screen. He looked sweaty. Grease was smeared across his cheek, and he was eating a piece of dried meat. "Oh, that," he said mid-chew. "That ain't a drive, Doc. That's Matthew's 7 children. They're playing tag in the cargo hold. I believe they have a grav stick." I stared at him. Every scientist from the 12 members stared at him. I dared not ask who Matthew was or why he had 7 children running loose in a pressurized tin can during a Tier 10 spatial breach. My mind simply refused to process the information. The human captain looked at his assistant, nodded once, and sat back in his creaking chair. He didn't check the Veil's resonance. He didn't calibrate his phase shifters. He just grabbed a joystick that looked like it had been salvaged from an ancient arcade. "All right, guys, this is it," he yelled. Then he looked at the camera, his eyes glinting with a sort of mad, uncalculated joy. "Engage the junk drive, now." The rusty bucket didn't glide forward. It lurched, it wobbled and groaned, its mismatched scrap metal rattling against the hull as it limped toward the Shimmer-Veil. We stood there, Rack, watching them go. We knew their stupidity was their doom. We were certain of it. We waited for the brilliant flash of light that would erase them from existence and prove that logic and science still ruled the universe. You don't beat the most advanced defense system in the universe with tag-playing children and a pile of welded trash. Or so we thought. Kelto's hands were shaking so violently now that he had to set his glass down. The phantom light of the Veil seemed to reflect in his dilated pupils as he leaned into the final, harrowing memory of the breach. "The rusty bucket lurched forward," Kelto whispered, his voice cracking. "It didn't fly. It waddled. Its engines were screaming, fighting the uneven, hideous weight of the scrap metal welded to its hull. It shuddered and vibrated with such violence that my station's sensors began to throw critical error warnings. Our computers literally didn't recognize it as a spacecraft. It was being categorized as a localized debris storm that happened to have a thruster. And then it touched the Shimmer-Veil. We all braced for it. Hundreds of scientists, the Zid, the Garthans, the Ixian, we all leaned forward, squinting, waiting for the familiar, blinding flash of molecular deconstruction. We waited for the rusty bucket to become a smear of glowing gas. But it didn't happen. The ship touched the iridescent curtain, and for the first time in 112 years, the Veil hesitated. It flared, yes, but it didn't strike. I remember the bridge of the Ethelgard going so silent you could hear the blood rushing through your own ears. Dr. Zarn's crystals turned a shock white. The Garthan lead dropped his data slate. We were flabbergasted. It was as if the most advanced defense system in the galaxy was staring at this pile of junk and asking, "What in the name of the precursors is this?" Usually the Veil glows with a precise, mathematical light as it calculates. It scans the incoming hull, finds the symmetry, and mirrors it to create a wall of infinite resistance. It is an elegant digital execution. But as the rusty bucket entered, the Veil went haywire. The sensors showed the anomaly trying to adapt, and it was like watching a god have a nervous breakdown. It detected the jagged stolen Ixian wing and created a high-intensity pressure wave to snap it. But because the wing was held on by those gods-forsaken bungee cords and expanding foam, it didn't snap. It just flopped out of the way, swaying on its cables, absorbing the energy like a wet rag. The Veil tried to calculate the ship's resonance to vibrate it apart, but the hull was vibrating at 14 different frequencies simultaneously because of the rattling girders and loose bolts. The anomaly began to flicker. Rack, I have never seen a precursor artifact stutter, but that's exactly what it did. It was like watching a supercomputer try to divide by zero. It couldn't find a pattern to mirror because there was no pattern. Then the ship hit a fold of concentrated gravity, a crusher zone that had turned our billion-credit dreadnoughts into pebbles. A normal ship, a logical ship, would have been crushed instantly. But because the human ship was so grotesquely uneven, And because its center of mass kept jumping around like a panicked animal, thanks to those 7 children playing tag in the hold, the gravity couldn't get a grip. Whether it was a stroke of absolute, divinely inspired genius or the most offensive streak of luck in the history of the species, I still don't know. The gravity well gripped a piece of scrap, the scrap bent, the center of mass shifted, and the ship simply spun away from the danger zone like a chaotic top. The human wasn't piloting, Rack. He was failing his way forward. Every time the Veil tried to grip the vessel, a piece of scrap metal would break off, a fuel pod would tear loose, a girder would snap away, and the ship's entire mass and signature would change in a microsecond. The Veil was fighting a ghost that changed its physical properties every 10 seconds. It was trying to lock a door that turned into a window, then a cloud, then a pile of leaves. "He's doing it," my assistant Pip gasped. I remember looking at him. His 4 eyes were wide with a kind of religious terror. The madman is actually doing it. The hundreds of scientists on the station were pressed against the glass, watching 100 years of physics being treated like a suggestion. With one final violent lurch, a groan of metal that we could almost hear through the vacuum, the rusty bucket shot out the other side of the Veil. It had lost half the scrap they'd attached. It was trailing a cloud of foam, loose bolts, and debris. But there it was. It drifted into the calm, open space of the Orestes hub, bobbing gently as if it hadn't just insulted the most advanced defense system in the galaxy. The silence on the bridge wasn't just quiet, Kelto said, staring into the bottom of his glass as if it were a window into the past. It was the sound of 12 civilizations' egos being sucked into a vacuum. We stood there, hundreds of us, watching that trailing cloud of rust and foam on the sensors. Kelto let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He slowly turned his head, his 4 eyes scanning the dim, smoke-filled room of the event horizon. "Look around you, Rack," Kelto whispered, gesturing with a trembling hand toward the other booths. "Look closely at the patrons in this dive. That Zid in the corner, drowning his crystals in liquid methane, that was the head of harmonic resonance. Those 3 Garthans huddled over the cheap synthale, they were the lead structural engineers for the Dreadnought X. Half the patrons in this bar tonight are the elite scientists from my UAC." He turned back to the memory of the view screen, his gaze going distant. The comms channel had crackled one last time after the breach. It was a dirty, lo-fi sound that felt like a slap in the face. The human captain was back on the screen. He looked a bit motion-sick, probably from his ship spinning like a toy. But he reached out and took his beer back from the young woman. He took a long, agonizingly slow sip and let out a sigh of pure, unadulterated satisfaction and wiped his mouth with the back of a greasy hand. "See, overthinking?" he said, gesturing with the can toward the pristine, starlit hub behind him. "That's your problem, Kelto. You and your buddies were trying to treat that field like a high-level math exam. Me? I treated it like a Saturday night in a dockside bar. You don't win a bar fight by being the most graceful guy in the room. You win by being the guy who's too twitchy to predict and too ugly to hit. You just dismantled a century of scientific dogma," I stammered. My voice didn't even sound like mine. It sounded small. With scrap metal and adhesive. "Hey, give me some credit, Doc," the human chuckled, and the sound of it made my crest ache. "It wasn't just scrap, it was industrial adhesive and some grade A rebar. Look, I've got a cargo of liver extract that isn't getting any fresher. If you smart folks want to get to the other side, stop building perfections. Build something that looks like it fell down 3 flights of stairs and sued the builder. The universe can't calculate a mess." The screen flickered and died. We watched the rusty bucket fire its one remaining, rattling engine. It didn't bank or turn with any elegance. It just kind of lurched away into the stars, trailing a few more loose bolts like a taunt. I didn't file a report. The truth was too insulting. We thought the Veil was a gatekeeper for the divine, waiting for a perfect object. We were wrong. It was a test of predictability. It was looking for logic so it could mirror it. By being a complete disaster, the human ship became a system error. The Veil didn't open the door. It just froze up and let the junk drift through because its brain broke trying to find a single straight line on that ship. Kelto finally looked up at his friend Rack, his four eyes bloodshot and weary. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a flyer for a shipyard on the station's lower levels. I resigned the next morning, Kelto whispered. I realized that for 100 years, we were trying to be the key. But the human, he realized that if you're messy enough, the lock just gives up. That's the part that keeps me awake, Rack. He wasn't a physicist. He wasn't a navigator or an engineer. He wasn't even curious. He was just a man with a cargo hold full of liver extract, a deadline and a dangerous amount of common sense, and absolutely no respect for the problem. He didn't look at the veil and see a mystery of the universe. He looked at it like a jammed door that just needed a good, hard kick in the right spot. I'm done with math, Rock. I'm going to go find a ship that looks like a brick, buy some bungee cables, and see if I can't find Matthew and those 7 kids. He stood up, left a few credits on the table, and walked out of the bar, leaving the elite of the elite behind for a life that was finally, gloriously uncalculated. Rack watched Kelto disappear into the crowd, then slowly turned to the bartender. What did you give him to drink? His mind seems compromised. The bartender shrugged, wiping a glass with a stained rag. Human stuff, he said. They call it beer. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Don't know why, but all the white coat types have been ordering it lately. He paused, then added, selling more of it tonight than I have in a year.